Hi, welcome back to the channel. Let's get started.
The sharp tang of gochujang usually overpowers everything in this kitchen, but tonight it couldn't mask the faint, bitter whisper of something deadly weaving through the steam. I balanced the trays, my eyes scanning the private booth where shadows played host to Seoul's most dangerous deals. For the first time since my sister's disappearance, my mother's old lessons on poisons stirred like a warning in my blood. The Lotus Pavilion was a cathedral of glass, gold leaf, and secrets. As a waitress, I was supposed to be part of the furniture, a ghost in a silk apron, but ghosts see everything. In the center booth sat Park Moo-jin. He didn't look like a mobster, he looked like a god carved from granite and dressed in a suit that cost more than my entire village back in Gabon. He was massive, his broad shoulders stretching the limits of his charcoal jacket, his hands resting on the table with a stillness that was more terrifying than a raised fist. Across from him sat the council, a collection of vultures in expensive ties. But my eyes weren't on the power players. They were on the hooded man at the edge of the service station, a guest who had arrived under the guise of a lowly associate. He was fumbling with a spice shaker, his movements too jagged, too frantic. As I approached with the heavy ceramic platters of sizzling bulgogi, a draft from the air vent carried a scent to me. It wasn't the sweet, charred aroma of pear-marinated beef. It was an acrid, almond-like undertone, sharp enough to make the back of my throat itch. Oleander mixed with a synthetic cyanide derivative, my mother's voice whispered in my mind. She had taught me that certain toxins reacted with iron-rich foods, turning the steam a fraction darker, almost a bruised purple. I saw the hooded man retract his hand, a tiny vial disappearing into his sleeve. He signaled the head waiter, pointing toward Moo-jin's plate with a subtle nod. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. If Moo-jin died here, the subsequent power vacuum would swallow Seoul whole, and any lead I had on my sister's disappearance would vanish into the pyre. I couldn't let him die. Not yet. I moved. My steps were fluid, practiced. I arrived at the table just as the hooded man leaned forward to adjust the placement of the dishes. I stumbled, a calculated, graceful trip that forced me to lean heavily into the table. "Forgive me, gentlemen," I murmured, my voice a low, steady hum. In the half-second of clattering ceramic and feigned clumsiness, my fingers blurred. I didn't just set the plates down, I pivoted. I slid the poisoned bulgogi toward the hooded man and placed the clean, steaming portion directly in front of Moo-jin. It was a sleight of hand born of desperation, and a decade of serving entitled men who never looked at my face. Welcome back, my cunning conspirators and velvet-veiled visionaries. Before we sink our teeth into this saga of swapped fates and crowned betrayals, make sure you're subscribed, smash that like button, and drop a comment with your city's secret spice. Where are you tuning in from? I adore watching our shadowy romance clan span oceans, alleys, and after-hours whispers. Every sub, every heart, every shared tale fuels our dive into these intoxicating webs of danger and desire. Brew your favorite elixir, hush the world, and brace for the twist. Let's unravel. I straightened my apron, my pulse roaring in my ears. I didn't look at Moo-jin. I looked at the hooded man. He was smiling, a thin, oily expression of triumph. He picked up his chopsticks, eager to maintain appearances while he waited for the Shadow Emperor to take the fatal bite. Moo-jin didn't eat. He sat back, his dark, heavy-lidded eyes tracking the sweat bead rolling down my temple. He picked up his fork, the silver gleaming like a dagger under the chandeliers. He held it mid-air, his gaze shifting from me to his plate, then to the man across from him. He was a predator who could smell the change in the wind. Then, the first sound of the end. A wet, choking gasp erupted from the hooded man. He had taken a large, arrogant mouthful of the poisoned beef. His chopsticks clattered to the floor. His hands flew to his throat, his eyes bulging as they turned a horrific, bloodshot red. Help! He tried to wheeze, but his lungs were already turning to liquid. He pitched forward, his forehead slamming into the table with a dull thud. Foam, tinged with a sickly yellow hue, bubbled at the corners of his mouth. The room exploded. Chairs screeched against the marble. Bodyguards drew weapons, the metallic shink of slides racking echoing through the pavilion. Moo-jin remained the only eye of the storm. He didn't flinch. He didn't reach for a gun. He simply watched the man die in the space where he should have been sitting. One of Mu Jin's enforcers lunged forward, ripping the hood off the dying man. The face underneath was pale, distorted by agony, but recognizable. Han's associate, the enforcer hissed. The faction from the docks. Mu Jin's eyes finally left the corpse. They drifted upward, locking onto mine with a terrifying magnetic intensity. I felt the heat of his gaze like a physical weight, a mixture of cold calculation and a burgeoning, dark curiosity. He saw the empty tray in my hand. He saw the lack of surprise in my eyes. He realized I hadn't just been a clumsy waitress. I had been a judge. He reached out, his large, calloused hand closing around my wrist. He didn't squeeze hard enough to bruise, but the grip was absolute. He pulled me half an inch closer, the scent of his expensive cologne, sandalwood and cold rain, overpowering the smell of death on the table. His voice was a low, melodic growl that vibrated in my very marrow. He stood up, towering over me, his shadow swallowing my smaller frame completely. The Shadow Emperor looked down at the woman who had just altered the fate of his empire with a simple swap of a plate. He leaned in, his lips brushing the shell of my ear, his breath hot against my skin. You redirected death tonight. Now, it owes you, and so do I. The promise in his voice was a low-frequency vibration that seemed to bypass my ears and settle directly in my marrow. But there was no time to process the weight of his words. Around us, the Lotus Pavilion fractured into 1,000 pieces of discord. The serene, gold-leafed sanctuary dissolved into a cacophony of screeching chairs and guttural shouts in Korean. Patrons, who only moments ago were sipping high-end soju, scrambled for the exits, their fear a palpable, sour scent that vied with the lingering almond bitterness of the poison. Mu Jin's grip on my wrist didn't slacken. If anything, it became an anchor. His enforcers, men with faces like weathered flint, swarmed the table. They didn't look at the dying man foaming on the floor. They looked at me, their hands hovering near the waistbands of their slacks. I forced my breathing to remain shallow and rhythmic, despite the adrenaline screaming for me to bolt. My mother always said that in the presence of a lion, you do not run, you show him you are not worth the hunt, or you show him you are the thorn he cannot afford to swallow. Move, Mu Jin commanded. It wasn't a request. He didn't drag me, but the sheer momentum of his stride forced me to keep pace as we were flanked by a wall of dark suits. We bypassed the main kitchen, the heat from the industrial woks blasting against my skin, smelling of charred garlic and frantic energy. The chefs stood frozen, cleavers mid-air, as the Shadow Emperor marched a lowly waitress through their sanctum. Every step I took on the linoleum floor felt heavy, my non-slip shoes squeaking, a mundane sound in a very lethal reality. I kept my head high, my mind already spinning like a centrifuge. I had to scrub the waitress mask and find the survivor underneath. If they thought I was a plant, I was dead. If they knew I was an expert, I was a tool. I had to be something in between, a fluke of nature they couldn't risk discarding. We reached a heavy soundproofed door at the end of a dimly lit corridor. One of the men punched a code into a keypad, and I was ushered, none too gently, into a cramped, windowless office. It smelled of old paper, cold coffee, and the faint, ozone scent of electronic equipment. Mu Jin finally released my wrist. The sudden absence of his heat felt like a cold splash of water. He walked toward a desk cluttered with monitors and sat on the edge of it, his long legs crossed at the ankles. He didn't look like a man who had just escaped an assassination. He looked like a man who was about to conduct a performance review. Sit, he said, gesturing to a cheap plastic chair. I didn't sit. I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms to hide the slight tremor in my fingers. I prefer to stand when I'm being interrogated. It's better for the circulation. A ghost of a smirk flitted across his lips, gone before I could be sure it was there. He picked up a tablet from the desk and tapped the screen. He turned it toward me. It was the security feed from the pavilion, high definition and hauntingly clear. I watched myself on the screen. I looked small, unassuming. I watched the moment I stumbled, the clumsy waitress routine, and the surgical precision with which I swapped the plates. Even on the grainy playback, the speed was impressive. You knew, Mu Jin said, his voice a calm, dangerous silk. You didn't just guess. You smelled it. You recognized a toxin that my own security detail, trained by the best in the peninsula, missed entirely. Why is a black waitress in a mid-level mob haunt an expert in Gabonese herbal lethality? My mother was a healer, I said, my voice steady, though my heart was a drum in a hollow chest. She taught me that the world is divided into things that nourish and things that kill. In my line of work, knowing the difference is just good business. I noticed the purple tint in the steam. I smelled the bitter almond. I didn't want a corpse in my section. The paperwork is a nightmare. He stared at me for a long beat, his dark eyes searching mine for a lie. He didn't find one, but he found something else. He tapped the tablet again, his thumb sliding across the glass. Solange Combilla. 3 years in Seoul. No criminal record. High marks in university back home. And a mountain of debt to a recruitment agency that usually deals in human cargo. He looked up, his gaze piercing. You're looking for someone. A sister? Priska. Disappeared 6 months ago near the Namdaemun docks. The mention of her name felt like a physical blow to my solar plexus. The air in the room suddenly felt too thin. My poise wavered for a fraction of a second, my hand reaching for the necklace hidden beneath my uniform, the last thing she'd given me. Don't say her name, I hissed, the smart heroine momentarily replaced by a wounded animal. I will say whatever I wish in my city, he countered, though his tone wasn't cruel. It was factual. He stood up, closing the distance between us in 3 predatory strides. He was so close I could see the golden flecks in his irises, the subtle line of a scar near his temple. He invaded my space, his presence an overwhelming pressure of sandalwood and power. The man who tried to kill me tonight was an associate of the faction that runs those docks, the same people who likely have your sister. You saved my life, Solange. But in doing so, you've signaled to every rival I have that you are an asset. If I let you walk out that door, you won't make it to the subway. They will take you, they will break you, and they will find out exactly how you detected their perfect poison. I can take care of myself, I lied, my back pressing into the hard wood of the door. Can you? Against an army? He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw, a touch that was terrifyingly light. I have a proposal. My empire is currently undergoing a restructuring. I need a distraction. A story to tell the council that explains why I'm suddenly changing my patterns, and you need a shadow large enough to hide in while you look for your sister. A distraction? I asked, my mind already calculating the variables. You want a fake fiancé. I want a woman who can spot a threat before my guards do, someone who can sit at my side and look like the woman who finally tamed the Shadow Emperor, while secretly acting as my most trusted filter. I clear your debts tonight. I give you access to my intelligence network, everything we have on the Namdaemun traffickers. In return, you move into my estate. You play the part. You stay alive. I looked at him, searching for the catch. And the playing the part, what does that entail? I'm not a concubine, Mu-jin. I don't trade my body for information. I don't need a body, he said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a dark velvet caress. I have plenty of those. I need that brain. I need those eyes. You will be my equal in the eyes of the public. No forced intimacy. You walk the moment your sister is found, or the moment the threat is neutralized. I want proof first. I challenged, my voice gaining strength. I want a lead. Something real. If you're the Emperor of Seoul, show me you're not just a king of shadows. Mu-jin reached for his phone, tapped a few keys, and turned the screen to me. It was a police manifest, redacted and hidden from public view. It showed a grainy photo of a girl being loaded into a black van. The birthmark on her wrist was unmistakable. My breath hitched. It was a lead. The first real one I'd seen in months. That was taken 48 hours ago, he said. Stay with me, and you'll find the van. I looked from the screen to his face. The danger was absolute, but the alternative was a slow death in a restaurant kitchen, waiting for a sister who would never come home. I reached out, my hand hovering near his lapel, not touching but asserting my space. I agree. But understand this, Mu-jin. I am not a damsel you rescued. I am a partner you've hired. If you lie to me, or if you use me as a pawn instead of a queen, I know 36 ways to stop your heart with the spices in your own pantry. Jin didn't flinch. Instead, he reached out, his hand cupping my jaw, his fingers splayed against my neck. His thumb brushed my lower lip, a possessive electric contact that made my skin hum. He leaned down, his lips a breath away from mine, his eyes darker than the ink of a secret contract. From this moment, you wear my name in public, he whispered, the erotic tension between us tightening like a garret. But remember, I don't own clever women. I collect them. And you, Solange. You are the crown jewel of my collection. He turned, heading for the door, leaving me breathless in the dim light. Pack your things. We leave for the Enclave in 10 minutes. 10 minutes. It was the amount of time it took to boil a pot of rice, or for a life to completely unspool. I was escorted back to the employee lockers by two of Jin's shadows, men who moved with a synchronized, predatory grace that made the kitchen staff shrink into the corners. My fingers fumbled with the rusted padlock of my locker. Inside was my entire life and soul, a worn leather satchel, a change of clothes that smelled of cheap laundry soap, and a small wooden box containing my mother's dried herbs and a single blurry photograph of Priska. I felt their eyes on my back, clinical, unblinking. I didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me shake. I shoved my uniform into the trash can, a silent goodbye to the girl who had spent a year scrubbing stains for tips. When I turned back, I was wearing my own clothes, faded denim and a dark sweater, but I felt naked under the weight of the contract I'd just signed with the devil. The transition from the back alley of the restaurant to the interior of Jin's car was like stepping between dimensions. The vehicle was a silent, black beast, the air inside smelling of expensive leather, and the faint, ozonic hum of high-end climate control. Jin was already in the back seat, a laptop glowing against his sharp features. He didn't look up as I climbed in, but I felt the air shift, a subtle gravitational pull toward his corner of the cabin. As the car glided through the neon-drenched veins of Seoul, I pressed my forehead against the cool glass. Every black van we passed made my heart stutter. Was Priska in one of them? Was she looking out at the same rain-slicked streets? I gripped the wooden box in my lap. Jin's silence wasn't cold, it was heavy, like the stillness before a landslide. I could feel him watching me in the reflection of the window, his gaze lingering on the way I held my mother's box. "You're checking the exits," he said suddenly, his voice a low vibration that seemed to travel through the leather seats. "Force of habit," I replied, not turning around. "In my neighborhood, if you don't know the way out, you don't go in." A wise philosophy. But where we are going, the exits are guarded by more than just locks. We began to climb. The city lights fell away, replaced by the dense, dark silhouettes of the woods surrounding the base of the mountains. Then, the Enclave appeared. It was a masterpiece of architectural contradiction. High, reinforced concrete walls topped with discreet, rotating cameras gave way to a massive gate of iron and dark timber. As we passed through, I saw the gleam of traditional curved roofs, the Hanok style, blending into sleek glass facades. It was a fortress disguised as a sanctuary. The car stopped in a central courtyard paved with smooth river stones. The air here was different, cleaner, smelling of pine and damp earth. As I stepped out, a group of guards bowed in unison. It was a chilling display of absolute authority. Jin stepped out beside me, his hand hovering just above the small of my back, not touching, but marking me as his. "Welcome home, Solange," he murmured. He led me through a series of sliding paper screens and polished wooden corridors. The floor beneath us was warm, ondel heating, a stark contrast to the drafty apartment I'd left behind. My room was in the east wing, a sprawling space of minimalist luxury, silk bedding, a private terrace overlooking a koi pond, and a vanity set with crystal carafes. But my eyes went straight to the security sensor near the door. It was a state-of-the-art motion and chemical detector, but as I stood near it, I noticed a faint, rhythmic clicking. It was struggling. The humidity from the nearby pond was causing a microscopic layer of oxidation on the intake vent, making it sluggish. "Is something wrong?" Jin asked, leaning against the doorframe, watching me with an unreadable expression. "Your security is blind in this corner," I said, walking toward the terrace. I stepped into the small, manicured garden. I knew these plants. Even in the moonlight, I recognized the silver-green leaves of lavender and the jagged edges of wild mint. I knelt, my fingers finding a cluster of lemongrass. I crushed the stalks between my palms, releasing a sharp citrusy oil. I returned to the censer and smeared a thin, invisible layer over the intake. "What are you doing?" One of the guards stepped forward, his hand on his holster. "Fixing it," I said, stepping back. "The oxidation reacts with the humidity. The lemongrass oil creates a hydrophobic barrier. It clears the sensor's throat so it can actually breathe. If someone tried to spray a sedative gas through that vent now, it would trigger the alarm instantly instead of lagging for 3 seconds. 3 seconds is long enough to die." Mu Jin's eyebrows arched. He stepped closer, sniffing the air. "Resourceful. Most women would have asked for the Wi-Fi password. You're checking for gaps in the armor. I told you, I'm a partner. I protect my interests." A maid appeared then, carrying a lacquered tray. "A gift, Master. From Director Ji-hoon. To welcome the new guest." It was an exquisite tea set, the porcelain so thin it was translucent. Inside the pot, a cluster of dried jasmine flowers waited for hot water. I stepped forward before the maid could pour. I didn't need to touch it. I leaned over the pot, inhaling deeply. Beneath the floral sweetness of the jasmine, there was a ghost of something else. It was faint, like the scent of crushed cherry pits. Bitter almond. Not the cyanide from earlier, but something slower. Aconite derivative. It wouldn't kill tonight. It would cause a slow, creeping paralysis over weeks, mimicking a natural illness. "Don't pour that," I said, my voice sharp. Mu Jin froze. "Explain." "The tea leaves have been sprayed with a tincture of monkshood. It's been dried into the fibers. In a week, you'd have a heart condition. In a month, you'd be a memory." I looked at him, my gaze level. "Your alley has very expensive tastes in murder." Mu Jin's face went completely still. A mask of terrifying, icy calm. He looked at the tea, then at me. The air in the room seemed to charge with an electric current. He signaled the guard. "Take this to the lab, I want a full breakdown, and find out exactly who handled this package." He turned back to me, his eyes burning with a new, dangerous light. It wasn't just suspicion anymore, it was fascination. He moved into my personal space, his chest nearly brushing mine. I could smell the sandalwood on his skin, feel the heat radiating from his massive frame. "It seems you are already paying dividends, Solange," he said, his voice a low, intimate rasp. "Dinner is served in the private hall," he continued, gesturing for me to follow. We ate in a room that felt like the heart of the mountain. A long, low table of black walnut sat between us. The meal was a silent battle of wits. I watched the way he handled his chopsticks, precise, lethal. I probed him about the council, about the man who had died at the restaurant. "The underworld is a garden," he said, watching me over the rim of his glass. "Sometimes you have to prune the branches to let the tree grow." Ji-hoon thinks he is a gardener. He doesn't realize he is just a weed. "And what am I in your garden, Mu Jin?" I asked, leaning forward, the silk of my new robe sliding against my skin. "A rare flower? Or a thorn?" He didn't answer immediately. He set his glass down and stood walking around the table until he stood directly behind my chair. He leaned down, his hands resting on the back of the seat, trapping me within the circle of his arms. The scent of him was intoxicating, a mix of power and a hidden masculine warmth. "You are the variable I didn't account for," he whispered, his breath stirring the hair at the nape of my neck. "And I find I am becoming obsessed with variables." He straightened, his gaze lingering on the curve of my throat before he pulled back. "Get some rest, Solange. Tomorrow, you begin earning your place. I want a full security review of the estate from your perspective. Show me every blind spot I have. Show me why I collected you." He left without another word, the sliding door clicking shut with a finality that echoed in the quiet room. I stood on the terrace, looking out at the dark woods. I was in the heart of the lion's den, and for the first time I wasn't sure if I was the hunter or the prey. But as I felt the weight of Priska's photo in my pocket, I knew one thing: I would burn this entire enclave down if it meant finding her. The silver-gray light of dawn was still clinging to the edges of the enclave's curved rooftops when I began my rounds. For 2 days I had walked these corridors not as a guest, but as a cartographer of risk. I noted the way the morning mist pooled in the shadows of the stone walls, potentially blinding the infrared sensors for 3-minute intervals. I felt the vibration of the subfloor heating beneath my feet, calculating how the thermal signature might mask a low-crawling intruder. Every observation was a coin I intended to spend on Priska's freedom. By mid-afternoon, the air in the main hall had turned static with tension. Mu Jin was presiding over a briefing with his inner circle, including the ever-watchful Ji-hun. I stood by the silk-screened windows, ostensibly admiring the garden, but my focus was entirely on the man at the head of the table. Mu Jin was a statue of composure, yet I saw the cracks. A subtle clench of his jaw every time the fluorescent lights hummed, the way his pupils constricted when a guard shifted a reflective tablet. When he reached up to press the heel of his palm into his left temple, I knew. It wasn't just a headache, it was a siege. The Shadow Emperor was being brought to his knees by a phantom behind his eyes. "The dock shipments are delayed," Ji-hun was saying, his voice a calculated rhythmic drone that I knew must feel like a hammer against Mu Jin's skull. "The council expects a resolution by—" "Enough," Mu Jin barked. The word was sharp, but I caught the slight tremor in his tone, the way he immediately closed his eyes to shut out the world. I didn't wait for permission. I stepped away from the window, my footsteps silent on the polished wood. "The master needs air," I announced, my voice cutting through the advisor's murmurs with a quiet authority that surprised even me, and a specific infusion. "Ji-hun, surely you can manage the logistics of a delay for 20 minutes while I tend to your brother's health." Ji-hun's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something dark and resentful dancing in his gaze. But he bowed stiffly. Mu Jin didn't protest. He looked at me, his eyes clouded with an agony so profound it made my own chest tighten. I saw the vulnerability he fought so hard to bury, the king who couldn't afford to blink. I hurried to the Enclave's kitchen, then out into the sun-drenched herbal patch I had scouted earlier. My fingers moved with a frantic, precise grace. I gathered feverfew, the bachelor's button my mother swore by for the rhythmic pulsing of the blood. I added a handful of peppermint for the nausea I saw turning his skin a sickly gray, and a thick, gnarled root of ginger to stoke the circulation. Back in the quiet of the small tea room adjacent to his office, I began the ritual. I crushed the feverfew leaves in a stone mortar, the bitter green scent rising to meet me, grounding me in the memories of my mother's hut in Gabon. I sliced the ginger into translucent coins, dropping them into a ceramic pot of simmering spring water. The peppermint went in last, added only after I pulled the pot from the heat to preserve its volatile oils. I let it steep, the steam rising in a fragrant, cooling cloud that seemed to push back the oppressive silence of the house. I strained the infusion into a heavy earthenware mug and carried it back to him. The meeting had dispersed. Mu Jin was slumped in his chair, the lights dimmed to a low, amber glow. "Drink this," I whispered, sitting on the edge of the low table beside him. "Slowly. The feverfew will quiet the nerves, the ginger will pull the pressure away from your brain." He took the cup, his large fingers brushing mine. His hand was cold, a stark contrast to the heat of the tea. He took a sip, his face contorting at the bitterness. "It tastes like dirt," he grunted. "Healing isn't always sweet, Mu Jin. Sometimes the earth has to remind you that you're part of it, not its master." As the minutes ticked by, I watched the tension slowly drain from his shoulders. The lines around his mouth softened. He leaned his head back against the leather, his eyes remaining closed, but his breathing leveled out into a deep, steady rhythm. "My father used to say that a leader who shows pain is a leader who invites the blade," he said softly, his voice echoing in the shadows. "When I was a child, the pollen from the pine forests would trigger these attacks. He would lock me in a cellar without light until I could stand straight again. He wanted to breed the weakness out of me." "Pain isn't a weakness," I said, leaning closer, the scent of the peppermint and ginger swirling between us. "It's a signal. Your body is telling you that you've been carrying the weight of this empire alone for too long. Even a mountain eventually erodes if the wind never stops." He opened his eyes then. The agony was gone, replaced by a searing, intense focus directed entirely at me. "And you, Solange? What weight do you carry? You speak of your mother as if she is a ghost sitting on your shoulder." "She is," I admitted, my voice dropping. She died protecting the secrets of the forest. She taught me that everything has an antidote if you're smart enough to find it. I'm still looking for the antidote to what happened to my sister. The atmosphere in the room shifted, the air growing thick and electric. Mu Jin stood up, his height once again imposing, but the predatory edge had softened into something more complex, something that looked dangerously like respect. He walked toward the desk and picked up a folder, sliding it toward me. "I've reviewed your notes on the sensors," he said. "The lemongrass trick was only the beginning. I want you to formally revise the protocols for the entire East Wing. You see the world in layers of scent and shadow that my men are blind to. Use that. I'll need access to the lower levels," I pushed, my heart racing. "The ventilation shafts, the service tunnels. If I'm to secure your life, I need to know every vein in this house." "You shall have it," he murmured. He moved toward me, stopping just inches away. I could feel the heat radiating from him, the sheer physical gravity of his presence. He reached out, his hand hovering near my neck. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. He didn't touch my skin. Instead, his fingers hooked gently under the thin silver chain of the necklace Priska had given me. He adjusted it, his knuckles grazing the hollow of my throat, sending a jolt of pure, unadulterated electricity through my veins. His eyes locked onto mine, dark and obsessive, tracing the path of his fingers. "This necklace," he said, his voice a low, rough caress. "It's the only thing you own that you didn't buy with your own sweat. It's your anchor, isn't it?" "It's my promise," I whispered, unable to look away. He lingered there for a heartbeat too long, his thumb brushing the very edge of my collarbone, a touch so light it could have been a dream, yet it felt like a brand. The erotic tension was a living thing between us, a cord stretched to the breaking point. "You ease more than my pain, Solange," he said, his voice dropping to a register that made my skin hum. "You make me question what I've always controlled. And that is the most dangerous thing you could do in this house." He pulled his hand away, but the ghost of his touch remained, burning against my skin. He turned to leave, pausing at the door. "Begin the review at midnight. I want to see how you handle the dark." I stayed in the amber light long after he left, my hand trembling as I touched the spot where his fingers had been. I was getting closer to him, closer to the heart of his power, and closer to the fire. I just had to hope I didn't burn to ash before I found the truth. The shadows of the Enclave at midnight weren't just dark, they were a living, breathing weight. I moved through the lower service corridors with a flashlight in one hand and my mother's wooden box in the other, my heart keeping a steady, rhythmic thrum against my ribs. I was a ghost, haunting the veins of a titan. Every few steps, I paused to inhale, filtering the air for the metallic tang of faulty wiring, or the sweet cloying rot of a slow gas leak. My collarbone still hummed where Mu Jin's fingers had lingered hours before, a ghost touch that felt like a brand of ownership I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to erase. I was reaching for a ventilation grate near the auxiliary power room when the world fractured. A shriek, high-pitched and jagged, tore through the silence. The sirens didn't just wail, they vibrated in my teeth. Above me, the emergency lights flickered to life, bathing the concrete walls in a rhythmic, nauseating pulse of crimson. Then came the hiss, a sound like 1,000 serpents. From the ceiling vents, a thick white plume of aerosolized simulant began to pour, designed to mimic a gas attack. My lungs seized. The scent hit me, acrid, chemical, and terrifyingly familiar. The tea, the steam, the way the light caught the froth on my mother's lips. Suddenly, I wasn't in a billionaire's fortress. I was 10 years old, back in the humid heat of Gabon, watching my mother's hands shake as she tried to brew a final desperate antidote for herself. I could smell the scorched herbs, hear her shallow, rattling breaths as the rival's toxin turned her blood to lead. I was paralyzed, a child again, drowning in the memory of a smell that meant the end of the world. Solange. A hand like an iron shackle closed around my upper arm. I gasped, swinging my flashlight blindly, but Mu Jin was already there. He looked like a dark god of war in the strobe light red, his jaw set, his eyes burning with a focused ferocity. He didn't ask questions. He hauled me toward a heavy, reinforced steel door I hadn't noticed in my mapping. He slammed his palm against the scanner, and the door hissed open. He shoved me inside and sealed the vault behind us. Silence rushed back in, thick and suffocating. The safe room was small, a pressurized box of brushed steel and emergency lead strips. The air was sterile, filtered, and bone-dry. I slumped against the wall, my knees giving way as I slid to the floor. My breath was coming in jagged, pathetic hitches. "It's a glitch," Mu Jin said, his voice a low grounding rumble in the small space. He was standing over me, his chest heaving, his expensive shirt unbuttoned at the collar. A sensor in the east wing misfired. "There is no gas, Solange. Look at me. Breathe." I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother's face. I saw the way her eyes had rolled back, the way she had pointed at the herb jars with a strength she didn't have left, begging me to learn, to remember, to survive. "I couldn't save her," I whispered, the words tasting like ash. The smell, it was just like the day they took her. She knew every root, every leaf, and they still found a way to turn the earth against her. Mu Jin knelt in front of me. In the dim amber glow of the emergency lights, his face lost its imperial mask. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He reached out and took my hand. His skin was hot, his calluses rough against my palm. "Tell me," he commanded softly. "A rival family," I said, my voice trembling as the PTSD ebbed into a raw, hollow ache. "They wanted her knowledge. When she refused to brew for their assassins, they poisoned the very well she drew her water from. I watched her die over a pot of tea she thought was medicine. I've spent every day since then looking for the scent of bitterness in every room I enter. That's why I found your poison, Mu Jin. I'm not smart. I'm just haunted." His grip on my hand tightened. He didn't look away. Instead, he turned my palm over, his thumb tracing a jagged silver scar that ran from the base of my thumb to my wrist, a souvenir from a shattered glass vial during my frantic attempt to help my mother. "We are both fueled by ghosts, then," he said, his voice dropping to a register so intimate it felt like a caress. He began to trace the line of the scar, his touch agonizingly slow, sending ripples of heat up my arm that had nothing to do with fear. My father didn't die of old age. He was executed by his own blood. Jihan's father, my uncle, was the one who held the door shut while it happened. I spent my youth learning how to be the person who holds the keys, so I would never be the one trapped inside again. He looked up, and the distance between us vanished. The safe room felt smaller, the air thick with the scent of his sandalwood cologne and the salt of my tears. He was so close I could see the pulse jumping in his neck, the dark, obsessive intensity in his gaze. "Closeness in my world is a blade turned inward, Solange," he whispered, his hand moving from my wrist to my cheek. His fingers were large, covering half my face, his thumb grazing my lower lip. The erotic charge was a live wire, humming between us in the silence. To care for someone is to give your enemy a map to your heart. "Then why are you still holding me?" I breathed, my own hand coming up to rest on his forearm, feeling the coiled power of his muscles. His eyes dropped to my mouth. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. He leaned in, his forehead resting against mine, his breath mingling with mine. I wanted him to bridge the gap. I wanted to lose myself in the dark empire of his arms, to forget the ghosts and the poison and the search for Priska. He stayed there, suspended on the edge of a kiss that would have changed everything. His thumb traced the curve of my lip once more, a possessive, lingering movement that made my breath hitch. Then, with a visible effort that made his shoulders tension, he pulled back just an inch. "Because I am a man who collects beautiful, dangerous things," he said, his voice rough and strained. "And I find I am no longer interested in just looking at you through a screen." The red lights outside the door turned green. The hiss of the vents stopped. The lockdown was over, but the atmosphere inside the vault remained charged, heavy with the weight of what we had almost done. Mu Jin stood up, offering me his hand to pull me to my feet. He didn't let go immediately once I was standing. He kept me close, his presence a towering shadow that I no longer wanted to flee. "You see too much of me, Solange," he said, his hand lingering on my cheek for one last, searing second. "And I find I no longer want to hide. Tomorrow the council holds their summit at the grand auction. You will go as my fiancé. You will wear my jewels and my name, and you will show them all that the Shadow Emperor has finally found his queen." He turned and opened the door, the cool air of the corridor rushing in. But as I watched him walk away, I knew the safe room hadn't kept us safe at all. It had simply stripped us bare. The transition from the raw, exposed intimacy of the safe room to the razor-edged glamour of the grand auction was a blur of silken strategy. By mid-morning, my room in the East Wing had been transformed into a staging ground. A team of silent, expert tailors had arrived, bearing a gown that looked less like clothing and more like a suit of armor forged from midnight. It was a Hanok-inspired masterpiece, a heavy, floor-length skirt of obsidian silk, paired with a sheer, embroidered giogori that shimmered with silver threads. As the tailors adjusted the hem, I stood like a mannequin, my mind elsewhere. While they focused on the drape of the fabric, I focused on the pockets I had insisted they sew into the inner lining of my garter and the hidden folds of the waistband. My mother's lessons were the only jewelry I truly trusted. With precise, steady hands, I tucked away a small silk sachet of activated charcoal powder, a universal sponge for ingested toxins, and a tiny glass vial of concentrated belladonna antidote I had distilled from the estate gardens. I was stepping into a den of vipers. I didn't intend to go without my own venom. Mu Jin entered the room just as the final pin was placed. The tailors vanished like smoke, sensing the sudden change in the room's atmospheric pressure. He was dressed in a traditional black durumagi over a modern suit, a look that bridged the gap between old-world power and new-world ruthlessness. He walked toward me, his boots clicking rhythmically on the polished wood, and stopped so close I could feel the heat of his body. He didn't speak. He reached into a velvet-lined box and pulled out a necklace of raw, uncut diamonds that looked like jagged shards of ice. He stepped behind me, his fingers grazing the sensitive skin of my neck as he fastened the clasp. The weight of the stones was heavy, a cold collar that marked me as his. "You look like a queen who has just declared war," he whispered, his reflection in the mirror appearing over my shoulder. His hands lingered on my shoulders, his thumbs tracing the line of my collarbone. "In your world, is there a difference between a queen and a target?" I asked, meeting his gaze in the glass. "None," he replied, his voice a low, dark caress. "But a target who can strike back is a god." The car ride to the underground venue was a study in silent electric tension. We were ensconced in the back of the armored limousine, the city of Seoul rushing past in a neon blur. Mu Jin's hand rested on my knee, his thumb absent-mindedly stroking the silk of my gown. It was a possessive gesture, one that made my pulse erratic, yet I found myself leaning into his strength. We were two predators heading into a cage match, and for the first time, I felt the terrifying pull of genuine partnership. The venue was hidden beneath a legitimate art gallery in the Gangnam district. After 3 levels of biometric security, the elevator opened into a subterranean ballroom that smelled of expensive cigar smoke, aged whiskey, and the metallic tang of hidden weapons. The air was thick with the polite venom of the underworld. Men in 5-figure suits and women dripping in blood rubies turned to stare as we entered. "Stay close," Mu Jin murmured, his arms sliding around my waist, his grip firm and uncompromising. As we navigated the crowd, I felt the weight of 100 assessing gazes. Whispers followed in our wake like a foul scent. The waitress, the Gabonese stray. Mu Jin's latest distraction. I kept my chin high, my eyes scanning the room not for friends but for threats. I watched the way a rival boss from the Busan syndicate gripped his glass too tight when we passed. I noticed the way the waitstaff moved, too rigid, their eyes too focused on the exits. Director Park. A voice dripped with honeyed malice. Ji-hyun appeared from the crowd, looking impeccably sharp, though his eyes were as cold as a winter sea. He bowed to Mu Jin, then turned his gaze to me, his lip curling in a micro-expression of disgust. "And the lady of the hour. A remarkable transformation. One might almost forget where you were found." "One might," I replied, my voice a cool, level blade. "Just as one might forget that a shadow only exists because of the light it tries to block." Ji-hoon's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Be careful, Solange. High places have thin air. Some people find they can't breathe." He drifted away, but the warning lingered. We moved toward the center of the hall, where the auction items were displayed on velvet-draped pedestals. My attention was immediately arrested by Lot 14, an ancient Goryeo-era jade incense burner, its surface carved with intricate dragons. As we approached, a familiar acrid itch started at the back of my throat. I leaned in, ostensibly to admire the craftsmanship, but my nostrils flared. Beneath the scent of the room's heavy perfumes, I detected it, the faint bitter almond whisper of an arsenic-based lacquer. The jade wasn't just old. It had been treated with a slow-acting, heat-activated poison. Anyone standing near it once the incense was lit would inhale a lethal dose within minutes. I leaned into Mu-jin, my lips brushing his ear as if sharing a lover's secret. "The jade burner," I whispered, my heart hammering. "It's been laced. Arsenic lacquer. If they light the coal for the demonstration, this room becomes a gas chamber." Mu-jin's posture didn't change, but I felt his muscles turn to steel beneath his suit. He didn't look at the vase. He looked at me, his eyes burning with a fierce, protective pride. He signaled to one of his men with a sharp, nearly invisible jerk of his chin. "Lot 14 is a forgery," Mu-jin announced, his voice projecting across the ballroom with the force of a physical blow. The room fell into a deafening silence. The auctioneer froze, a gavel hovering in mid-air. "A forgery?" The rival boss from Busan sneered, stepping forward. "Or is the Shadow Emperor simply trying to drive the price down so his companion can have a new trinket?" Mu-jin stepped forward, pulling me flush against his side. His hand was a warm, heavy weight on my waist, a public claim that brooked no argument. "My companion does not need trinkets. She has a nose for rot, and she has just informed me that this piece is a death trap. If you doubt her word, feel free to light the incense, Lee. I'll make sure your funeral is as lavish as your ignorance." The tension in the room was a living thing, a cord stretched to the snapping point. Mu-jin's defense wasn't just a tactical move, it was an act of war on my behalf. He was staking his reputation on the instincts of a waitress. I looked up at his profile, the sharp jawline, the cold, narrowed eyes, and realized with a jolt of pure electricity that his rage was personal. He wasn't just protecting an asset, he was protecting me. Ji-hoon stepped back into the light, his face a mask of feigned concern. "Brother, surely you aren't letting a servant dictate the council's acquisitions? It looks weak." Mu-jin turned to his brother, his eyes flashing with a terrifying, icy light. "She is the woman who will sit beside me when I burn the council to the ground, Ji-hoon. If you call her a servant again, you will find out exactly how much weakness I can exert with a single bullet." The room exhaled. No one dared to light the jade. The auctioneer moved on to the next lot with trembling hands, but the damage was done. The power dynamic of the room had shifted. Mu-jin leaned down, his forehead briefly touching mine amidst the retreating crowd. His scent, sandalwood and cold fury, swirled around me, intoxicating and empowering. "They see you as a weakness," he whispered, his voice for my ears alone, thick with a rising, dark obsession. "Let them. You are becoming my greatest strength, Solange. And soon, they will realize that the only thing more dangerous than a king is the queen who knows all his poisons." He pulled me closer, his hand lingering on the curve of my hip as we walked toward the exit. I felt the heat of his gaze and the weight of the diamonds, but for the first time, the heavy air of the underground felt like home. I was no longer just looking for Priska. I was building a throne to find her from. The morning light filtered through the paper screens of the enclave, with a softness that felt like a lie. It was a honeyed amber glow that caught the steam rising from the 2 ceramic cups of coffee, sitting between us on the low walnut table. For the first time, the silence between Mu-jin and me wasn't a battlefield. It was a sanctuary. I sat in a simple silk robe, my skin still humming from the memory of his public claim the night before. Mu-jin reached across the table, his large hand covering mine. He didn't say anything, but the way his thumb traced the line of my knuckles was a language in itself. The Shadow Emperor looked human. The tension in his shoulders had ebbed, replaced by a quiet, domestic peace that I found myself wanting to cling to with both hands. I thought of Priska, and for a fleeting, guilty second, I imagined a world where she was safe in the next room and this man was simply my partner, not my protector. "The council is reeling," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly caress. You didn't just find a poison, Solange. You shook their foundation. They realize now that I'm no longer playing by their rules. Rules are just chains for people who are too afraid to lead, I replied, leaning into his touch. He smiled, a real fleeting curve of his lips, and leaned forward, his forehead nearly touching mine. The scent of him, that intoxicating mix of sandalwood and expensive coffee, filled my senses. I felt a dangerous hope blooming in my chest, a belief that perhaps we had actually crossed the threshold from a strategic alliance to something unbreakable. Then, the sanctuary shattered. The sliding doors didn't just open, they were slammed back against the frames with a violent crash. I jerked my hand away, my heart leaping into my throat as Ji-hun marched into the room. He wasn't composed today. He was vibrating with a performative, frantic energy, clutching a tablet and a stack of printed documents. Mu-jin, stop. Ji-hun gasped, his eyes darting to me with a look of feigned pity that made my stomach turn. It's over. The leak, we found the source. Mu-jin stood slowly, his face hardening into that familiar frozen mask of command. What is this, Ji-hun? I told you not to disturb us. I couldn't wait, Ji-hun hissed, throwing the tablet onto the table between our coffee cups. I was tracking the encrypted pings from the rival syndicate, the ones who orchestrated the auction trap. They weren't hacking us, brother. They were being invited in. I looked down at the screen, and the air left my lungs as if I'd been kicked. There were logs of messages, dozens of them. My name was at the top of the contact header. Solange Kombila. The messages were horrific, timestamps from the nights I was supposed to be doing security reviews, detailed descriptions of the Enclave's lower-level blind spots, and most damningly, photos of the safe room keypad. Then came the final blow, a wire transfer receipt for a staggering amount of Bitcoin, deposited into an offshore account in my mother's maiden name. Attached was a photo of a handwritten note, the script a perfect, elegant imitation of my own handwriting. The Emperor is distracted. Move now while he trusts me. No, I whispered, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. I looked up at Mu-jin. Mu-jin, look at the timestamps. I was with you during half of these. This is a fabrication. It's too perfect. Mu-jin didn't look at me. He was staring at the tablet, his eyes dark and hollow. The silence that followed was more agonizing than any scream. It was a heavy, suffocating shroud that settled over the room. I saw the muscles in his jaw ripple, saw the way his hand, the same hand that had just been stroking mine, clenched into a white-knuckled fist. Mu-jin, listen to me, I pleaded, standing up, my hands trembling. Look at the phrasing in the notes. I would never use those terms. This is a trap. Jae-hyun is the only one who... Enough, Mu-jin said. The word wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a guillotine blade. He finally looked at me, and I felt my soul wither. The warmth was gone. The respect was gone. In its place was a cold, jagged betrayal that mirrored the stories he'd told me of his father. I wasn't his queen anymore. I was just another ghost in his history of backstabs. I gave you the keys, he whispered, his voice cracking with a raw, bleeding edge. I gave you my name. I let you see the parts of me that I had buried for 20 years, and you used them to price my head for the highest bidder. I didn't. Mu-jin, please, look at the metadata on the photos. The metadata has been verified by 3 different security teams. Solange, Jae-hyun interrupted, stepping closer with a triumphant sneer he barely bothered to hide. You're good. Using your sister's search as a cover for your meetings with the docs? It was brilliant. But even a clever waitress misses a trail. Mu-jin turned away from me, staring out at the garden. His silence stretched, a widening chasm that I knew I could never jump. Every second that passed without him defending me felt like a fresh wound. Get out, he said, his back still turned. Mu-jin, get out. He roared, whirling around. His eyes were bloodshot, his face a contorted map of agony and rage. If I see you in Seoul again, if I even hear your name, I will kill you myself. I will not be the fool who waits for the blade to reach his heart. Guards. The doors swarmed with men. They weren't the respectful shadows from before, they were enforcers. They grabbed my arms, dragging me toward the exit. I struggled, my robe catching on the table, knocking over the coffee cups. The amber liquid spilled across the white silk, looking like a spreading bruise. Ji-hoon is the traitor, I screamed as they hauled me through the corridor. Check his accounts. Check the... In the chaos of the struggle, as we passed Ji-hoon, his phone vibrated in his jacket pocket. He reached in to silence it, and for a split second the screen flared toward me. It was a notification from a messaging app, a thumbnail of a photo. It was a picture of a rusted van door with a very specific hand-painted logo of a lotus with a broken stem. My heart stopped. That logo wasn't in the files Moo-jin showed me. It was new. As the guards shoved me toward the service entrance, my hand brushed a discarded envelope on the hallway console, a piece of mail addressed to Ji-hoon from a logistics company. I didn't think. I used the sleight of hand I'd perfected as a waitress and palmed the corner of the envelope, shoving it into the deep pocket of my robe just as the heavy iron doors of the enclave were thrown open. They didn't just escort me out, they threw me. I hit the gravel of the driveway hard, the sharp stones biting into my knees. Within seconds, the sky, as if sensing the shift in my life, opened up. A torrential, freezing rain began to pour, soaking through my robe and chilling me to the bone. The iron gates of the enclave hissed shut, the sound of the locks engaging like a final heartbeat. I sat there in the mud, stripped of the diamonds, stripped of the silk, and stripped of the man I had started to love. The rain mixed with the hot, bitter tears streaming down my face. Everything was gone. My debts were likely reinstated, my name was blacklisted, and I was back on the streets of a city that wanted me dead. I looked at my hands, raw and shaking. Then, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the torn corner of the envelope and the memory of that phone screen. The lotus with the broken stem. The despair didn't vanish, but beneath it, a cold, predatory fire began to kindle. Ji-hoon hadn't just stolen my life, he had Priska. He had used her as the bait for his own brother's destruction. I stood up, the rain plastering my hair to my face. I looked back at the fortress on the hill, the enclave that was now my tomb. My resolve hardened into a blade of unbreakable Gabonese steel. They think they've broken me, I whispered into the howling wind, my voice a low, lethal promise. They've only given me the map to burn their house down. You should have killed me, Moo-jin, because now I'm the only one who can save you, and I'm going to make you bleed for doubting me. I turned away from the gates and began to walk into the dark, the clue clutched in my fist like a weapon. Phase 8 was coming, and this time, I wasn't bringing herbs. I was bringing a reckoning. The rain had never stopped. It was a cold, relentless shroud that clung to the ridgeline of the Bukhansan foothills, masking my silhouette as I crouched among the dripping pines. My fingers were numb, but my mind was a white-hot engine. For 48 hours, I had been a ghost in the trees. I hadn't left. I couldn't. Not with the image of that lotus logo burned into my retinas, and the scrap of Ji-hoon's envelope tucked against my skin. I adjusted the binoculars, my breath hitching as the enclave's perimeter lights flickered. Below me, the fortress was quiet. Too quiet. The air smelled of ozone and wet pine, but then a new scent drifted upward. Gasoline. Suddenly the night erupted. A thunderous boom shook the earth. The main gates didn't just open, they were vaporized. 2 black SUVs roared through the smoke, followed by a wave of men in tactical gear. No banners, no names, just professional killers. Jae-hyun was no longer playing the long game, he was burning the board. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, jagged rhythm. Move or die, Solange. I watched the balcony of the East Wing. Moo-jin appeared. He was a blur of lethal motion. He didn't use a gun at first. He used a heavy wooden practice sword, breaking a mercenary's neck with a sickening crack before stripping the man's sidearm from his holster. He was a god of war in a blood-spattered dress shirt. But there were too many of them. I saw him catch a graze to the shoulder. He staggered. 3 more men converged on his position. Rage, cold and blinding, replaced the hollow ache in my chest. He was a fool for doubting me, but he was my fool. And I wasn't done with him yet. I reached for my satchel. I had spent my exile scavenging. In the estate's outer gardens, I had harvested the late-season datura, the devil's trumpet. I had dried the seeds over a small hidden fire and crushed them into a fine hallucinogenic dust. I mixed it with sulfur I'd scraped from old matches and a handful of dried, oily pine needles. I pulled a flare gun I'd lifted from a security outpost earlier that night. I packed my mixture into a hollowed-out flare casing. This wasn't just smoke, it was a sensory nightmare. I slid down the muddy embankment, my boots skidding on the slick rock. I reached the perimeter wall, scaled the service ladder I'd mapped out days ago, and hit the terrace with a muffled thud. The air was thick with the scent of cordite and copper. "Target in the library," a voice barked in Korean. I didn't think. I fired the flare into the center of the hallway. Pop. The casing shattered. A thick, yellowish-white fog billowed instantly. It wasn't just opaque, it was toxic. The men caught in it began to cough, their movements turning jerky and uncoordinated as the datura hit their nervous systems. I moved through the cloud like a specter. My mother's training was a symphony in my head. Low center of gravity. Strike the soft tissue. Use their weight against them. A mercenary lunged at me through the haze. I didn't trade punches. I jammed a small, needle-tipped vial of concentrated oleander extract, the same poison from the restaurant, directly into the gap between his tactical vest and his neck. He didn't even scream. He just folded, his nervous system short-circuiting in seconds. I took his combat knife. It felt heavy and cold. I reached the library doors. They were riddled with bullet holes. Inside, the room was a wreck of shattered glass and shredded books. Moo Jin was backed against the walnut desk, his shirt soaked in crimson, his face a mask of exhaustion and lethal intent. He was down to his last magazine. Two men were advancing, their red laser sights dancing across his chest. I didn't give them a chance to pull the triggers. I threw a handful of the blinding powder, crushed pepper and limestone, directly into their faces. As they shrieked, clutching their eyes, I moved. Step. Pivot. Slice. The knife found its mark twice in the time it took for them to fall. Silence rushed back in, broken only by the crackle of a fire starting in the curtains and Moo Jin's ragged breathing. He didn't lower his gun. He pointed it straight at my head, his hand shaking, his eyes bloodshot and filled with a frantic, desperate confusion. "Why?" he rasped, his voice a broken shell of the Emperor's growl. "Why return to a man who threw you to the wolves? Why die for a liar, Solange?" I stepped forward, the knife held loosely at my side, the rain-soaked silk of my robe clinging to me like a second skin. I didn't look at the gun. I looked at him. "Because the real liar is inside these walls," I said, my voice as sharp as the blade in my hand, "and because I found the van, Moo Jin, the lotus with the broken stem. Your brother didn't just frame me. He's the one who took my sister. He's been selling your secrets to the docks to fund his own coup." Moo Jin's arm wavered. The gun lowered an inch. "I saw the logs. I saw the bank records. You saw what a traitor wanted you to see," I countered, stepping into his personal space. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I pressed them against the wound on his shoulder. The heat of his blood was a shock against my cold skin. "He used your trauma against you. He knew you'd flinch if you smelled betrayal. But I'm still here. I'm the only one who didn't run." The sound of heavy boots echoed in the hallway. More of them were coming. Ji-hun was closing the net. Moo Jin looked at my hand on his shoulder, then up at my eyes. The icy walls he'd rebuilt in the safe room didn't just crack, they disintegrated. He dropped the gun, his hand coming up to grasp my forearm, his grip bruising and possessive. He pulled me flush against his chest, the scent of sandalwood, sweat, and blood swirling around us. "You came back," he whispered, his forehead dropping onto mine. It wasn't a question. It was an admission of a soul-deep relief that terrified him. "I never left," I replied, my hand sliding up to cup his jaw, my thumb catching a smear of blood on his cheek. "I'm the thorn in your side, remember? You don't get to die until I say so." A shadow fell across the doorway. Ji-hun stood there, flanked by 3 men. He held a high-caliber pistol, a look of pure, unadulterated venom on his face. He saw us, clinging to each other in the wreckage, and let out a hollow, jagged laugh. "How touching," Ji-hun sneered. "The waitress and the Emperor, dying in a pile of ash." Moo Jin straightened, his arm shifting to wrap around my waist, pulling me into his side. He didn't look like a wounded man anymore. He looked like a king who had just found his crown. He reached behind him, his hand finding the hidden latch on the desk I'd missed in my reviews. He pulled out a heavy matte black assault rifle. "You should have aimed for the heart, brother," Mujin said, his voice a low, lethal promise that vibrated through my body. I reached into my satchel, my fingers closing around the final, most volatile concoction I'd made, a flash igniter that would turn this room into a sun. I looked at Mujin, and in that shared glance, the bond we'd forged in the safe room became an unbreakable vow. "Now," I whispered, "let's finish what he started." The smoke began to rise again. The reckoning had arrived. The air in the library was no longer oxygen. It was a pressurized soup of ash, datura smoke, and the metallic tang of impending death. I felt Mujin's arm tighten around my waist, a possessive, grounding force that told me he wouldn't let go again, even if the world collapsed. Ji-hoon stood across the wreckage, his handsome face distorted into a gargoyle's mask of hatred. "Do it," I whispered, the word a trigger. I threw the flash igniter. It struck the marble floor between us and blossomed into a blinding white-gold sun. The roar was deafening, a wall of heat that sucked the remaining air from the room. In that split second of white out, Mujin moved. He didn't fire the rifle wildly. He moved with the surgical grace of a phantom. I followed his shadow. We didn't just fight, we dismantled. The mercenaries were disoriented, clutching their eyes, but I was the daughter of a woman who taught me to see with my nose and my skin. I ducked under a blind swing, drove my elbow into a solar plexus, and used the man's own momentum to hurl him into the growing fire. Mujin's rifle barked. 3 precise, rhythmic shots. Ji-hoon fled. He scrambled through the burning debris toward his private office, a glass-walled sanctum at the end of the wing. We pursued him through a gauntlet of falling beams and searing heat. My lungs burned, every breath a scrape of sandpaper against my throat, but the adrenaline was a cold, steady river in my veins. We cornered him against his mahogany desk. The glass walls behind him reflected the inferno consuming the enclave. He was out of ammunition, his hair disheveled, a frantic cornered animal. "Stay back," Ji-hoon shrieked, fumbling for a heavy brass letter opener. "You think you're the king, Mujin? You're a bastard. A mistake. Our father didn't just have one son. He had a secret he kept in the slums. A woman he actually loved before he married your cold, aristocratic mother." Mujin froze, his rifle leveled at Ji-hoon's chest. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the crackle of burning timber. "What are you talking about?" Mujin's voice was a low, dangerous rumble. I stepped forward, reaching into the pocket of my charred robe. I pulled out the envelope corner and the folded document I'd snatched during the chaos of my exile, a birth certificate and a legal testament I'd pieced together while hiding in the woods. "He's your half-brother, Mujin," I said, my voice cutting through the roar of the fire. "The logistics company on this envelope? It's a front for the uncle who held the door shut when your father was killed. Ji-hoon wasn't just your advisor. He was the legacy of your father's greatest betrayal. He's been working with the Namdaemun docs because that's where his mother's family operates. He didn't just want your empire. He wanted to erase the rightful heir." Ji-hoon let out a jagged, hysterical laugh. "And I would have done it. I had the docs. I had the council. And I had the perfect leverage." He looked at me, his eyes gleaming with a sickening triumph. "Your sister Solange. She was so brave. Even when we realized she'd seen too much at the docks, even when the poison started to work, she never stopped calling your name." The world slowed to a crawl, the sounds of the fire muffled, replaced by the thundering roar of my own heartbeat. My vision tunneled until all I saw was Ji-hoon's mocking smile. "Where is she?" I rasped, my hand going to the necklace. "In the ground," Ji-hoon spat. "I killed her to make sure there were no loose ends. And now, I'll finish the set." In a blur of desperate motion, Ji-hoon lunged. He didn't use the letter opener. He slammed a small, spring-loaded injector into my shoulder as I tried to block him. I felt the cold bite of the needle, the rush of a foreign substance entering my bloodstream. I fell back, my legs turning to water. "Solange." Mujin roared, but Ji-hoon was already scrambling for the balcony. The toxin hit like a physical wall. my vision blurred, the edges of the room fraying into dark, oily shadows. My heart rate plummeted, a heavy, sluggish thrum. Aconite, I realized through the fog. High concentration. Cardiac arrest in 60 seconds. Mu Jin was over me in an instant, his hands shaking as he cradled my head. No, no, no. Solange, look at me. The satchel, I choked out, my tongue feeling twice its size. Inner pocket, charcoal, and the blue vial. My hands felt like lead weights, but I forced them to move. I couldn't die. Not like this. Not while he was still alive. I fumbled for the small leather pouch at my waist. My mother's voice was a scream in my mind. Focus. Slow the blood. Neutralize the base. I found the blue vial, a concentrated extract of hawthorn and atropine-rich belladonna I'd distilled. It was a gamble. Too much would stop my heart just as fast as the poison, but it was the only counteragent for the aconite's paralysis. Mu Jin. The pressure point, I gasped, grabbing his wrist and guiding his thumb to the base of my throat, pressing hard against the carotid to slow the systemic spread. I uncorked the vial with my teeth and swallowed the bitter, searing liquid. Then, I shoved a handful of the activated charcoal powder into my mouth, the dry, gritty dust coating my throat, acting as a sponge for whatever toxin hadn't yet entered my veins. I forced myself to swallow, to breathe, to fight the darkness pulling at my heels. For a heartbeat, the world went black. Then, a sudden violent jolt of electricity snapped through my chest. My heart kicked back into a frantic, uneven rhythm. The numbness in my limbs receded into a dull, throbbing ache. I looked up. Mu Jin was staring at me, tears streaming down his face, his expression one of pure, unadulterated terror. He pulled me against him, his face buried in my neck, his entire massive frame shaking with sobs. I thought I lost you again, he choked out. I pushed back, my strength returning in a cold, hard wave. Ji-hoon was at the edge of the balcony, looking back at the wreckage of his plan. Mu Jin stood up, picking up his rifle, his face settling into a mask of absolute final judgment. He leveled the barrel at his brother's head. Wait, I said, my voice raspy but firm. I stood up, leaning on the desk for support. Mu Jin didn't lower the gun. He killed her, Solange. He killed your sister. He tried to kill us both. There is no mercy for this. I know, I said, walking toward them, my eyes locked on Ji-hoon's trembling form. But death is a mercy he doesn't deserve. If you kill him now, he becomes a martyr for his own twisted cause. Let him live in the shadows he loves so much. Let him spend the rest of his life in a cage, knowing that the waitresses and the bastard are the ones who took everything from him. Ji-hoon looked at me, his eyes wide with a new kind of fear. The fear of a man who realized he would never be forgotten, only erased. Mu Jin looked at me, then back at his brother. Slowly, with a visible effort, he lowered the rifle. He didn't shoot. He stepped forward and delivered a single crushing blow with the butt of the gun to Ji-hoon's temple. The traitor slumped to the floor, unconscious. The enclave was a skeleton of fire around us. We stood in the ruins of an empire, the smoke swirling like the ghosts of everyone we had lost. Mu Jin turned to me, his clothes torn, his skin blackened by soot and blood. He reached out, his hand cupping my jaw with a tenderness that broke my heart. I am so sorry, he whispered, his voice cracking. For everything. For doubting you. For the world I dragged you into. We dragged each other, I said, leaning into his palm, my tears finally falling, hot and cathartic. For Priska. For my mother. We're the only ones left to remember them. Mu Jin pulled me into a crushing embrace. I clung to him, my face buried in the crook of his neck, breathing in the scent of sandalwood, smoke, and survival. The empire was ash, but as I felt his heart beating against mine, I knew we had found the only thing that couldn't be poisoned. No more ghosts, Solange. He vowed into my hair, his grip tightening. From the ashes, we rebuild. And this time, we do it as equals. I looked out at the burning horizon of Seoul, the sun beginning to peek through the smoke. The search was over. The reckoning was done. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving. I was home. The sharp tang of gochujang no longer hides the scent of betrayal tonight. It merely seasons the celebration of an empire reborn. 6 months have passed since the enclave burned, and from those ashes, we built something that doesn't need to hide in the dark. The new estate is a marvel of glass and ancient timber, but its true strength lies in the greenhouses. My mother's legacy is no longer a collection of survivalist secrets. It is the cornerstone of our legitimate pharmaceutical exports. We don't just trade in shadows anymore, we trade in the antidotes the world is desperate to possess. I stand at the head of the polished obsidian table in the boardroom, my fingers tracing the rim of a crystal glass. I'm no longer wearing a waitress's silk apron or a borrowed gown. I wear a tailored suit of charcoal silk, the cut sharp enough to draw blood. The distribution metrics for the Busan sector are lagging, I say, my voice a cool level chime that commands the room. And I suspect it's because the regional manager thinks the new regime is soft. A new advisor, a man named Juan, who still smells of old-world arrogance and cheap cigarettes, scoffs under his breath. He doesn't look at me, he looks at the empty chair beside me where Mu Jin usually sits. With all due respect, Lady Solange, we are used to a certain masculine grit in our negotiations. A waitress might understand spices, but the logistics of a multi-billion-won merger are. The logistics of your secret gambling debt to the Japanese syndicate are far more interesting, Juan. I interrupt, my tone conversational. I don't raise my voice. I don't have to. The room goes deathly silent. You've been skimming from the shipping insurance to pay off your losses. I noticed the discrepancy in the chemical weight of the lavender shipments last Tuesday. You thought a 2% margin wouldn't be missed. You forgot who runs the scales. Juan's face drains of color, the arrogance vanishing as he realizes he's been dissected before he even finished his sentence. I lean forward, the diamond shards at my neck catching the light. In my old section, I used to clear the trash after the meal was over. Don't make me start cleaning again. The doors slide open, and Mu Jin walks in. He doesn't go to his chair. He walks straight to me, his presence a massive warm weight that settles the air. He places a hand on the small of my back, a touch that is no longer a claim of ownership, but a gesture of absolute shared power. He looks at Juan, then back to me, a proud, lethal smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. The meeting is adjourned, Mu Jin says, his voice a low, possessive rumble. My partner has already found the rot. Remove him. As the guards drag a stammering Juan from the room, Mu Jin turns to me. He reaches into his pocket and pulls out a ring. It isn't a delicate trinket. It's a heavy band of platinum set with a rare black diamond that glows like a trapped star. He slides it onto my finger, his thumb lingering on my pulse point, feeling the steady, triumphant beat of my heart. You aren't just my queen, Solange, he whispers, pulling me flush against his chest.